They called her a thief in every newspaper that would print it. The fraud of the healthcare sector. The woman who built an empire on stolen ideas. A con artist in a white coat. The headlines ran for 3 weeks before the trial even started, and by the time Margaret Osibansu walked into the federal courthouse, on a Tuesday morning in October, half the country had already decided she was guilty. She was 51 years old. She had spent 23 years building Clarity Path Diagnostics from a converted garage in Columbus, Ohio, into one of the fastest-growing medical technology companies in the Midwest. She had 2 patents filed in her own name, a staff of 400 people, and a daughter finishing her 2nd year of medical school at Johns Hopkins. She had also, according to the lawsuit filed by Verantis Medical Systems, stolen the proprietary algorithm at the core of her company's diagnostic software, stolen it from them, dressed it in new code, and sold it to hospitals for 6 years while Verantis watched their market share collapse. None of it was true. But truth, she was learning, cost money she no longer had. The morning her lead attorney walked out, the sky over Columbus was the flat gray color of old concrete. Margaret sat at the defense table in courtroom 4 and watched the door close behind him. Then she watched his second chair close it. Then the paralegal, who had spent 11 months organizing her case files. They moved quickly, with the practiced efficiency of people who had made this calculation before and found it easy. The judge, a man named Honorable Patrick Odom, looked at her over his reading glasses. He was not unkind, but he was not warm either. He was a man who had seen every variety of legal catastrophe and had learned to watch them from a careful distance. "Mrs. Osibansu," he said, "do you have counsel to represent you in this proceeding?" Margaret looked at the empty chairs beside her. She looked at the table, still covered in folders her attorneys had not bothered to take because the documents inside them were hers, and not theirs, and they had no use for paper they could not bill. She looked at her hands, folded flat on the table, and for a moment she was completely still. "No, Your Honor," she said. "I don't." There was a murmur through the gallery. The Verantis team, 3 lawyers in dark suits arranged in a neat row across the aisle, did not murmur. One of them wrote something on a legal pad. Another checked his watch. Margaret had been preparing for something like this for months, in the quiet way that people prepare for disasters they can sense approaching but cannot stop. The way you double-check the emergency kit before a storm that may or may not arrive. She had known her attorneys were unhappy. She had known the litigation fund was depleting faster than projected. She had not known they would leave 20 minutes before opening statements. She had worked 70-hour weeks for 2 decades. She had eaten lunch at her desk, more days than she could count. She had taken calls at midnight and answered emails at 5 in the morning and missed her daughter's high school graduation because she was in a conference room in San Francisco, trying to save a contract that would keep 43 people employed. She had done all of that, and more, and now she was sitting alone at a defendant's table in a federal courtroom, while a corporation with $9 billion in annual revenue tried to take everything she had built. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried easily, and she was not going to start in a room full of journalists. What she did was breathe, slowly, the way her father had taught her when she was small, in through the nose, hold it, let it out quiet. Her father had been a custodian at a hospital in Accra for 30 years. He had told her once that the most important skill in a hard room was to look like you belonged there even when you felt like you didn't. She thought about that now. She looked up at Judge Odom. "I'd like to request a brief continuance to secure new representation, Your Honor." The Verantis attorney, the one who had checked his watch, stood up. His name was Bradford Lee, and he had argued before the Sixth Circuit 17 times. "Your Honor, the defense has had over a year to prepare for this trial. Verantis objects to any delay. Our witnesses have traveled. The timeline? Your objection is noted, Mr. Lee." Judge Odom looked at Margaret again. "Miss Osibansu, I'm going to grant you 2 hours. Court will recess until 11. I strongly advise you to use that time productively." She called 4 attorneys in 2 hours. 3 didn't answer. The 4th listened politely for 90 seconds and then said, with genuine regret, that he couldn't take a federal IP case with same-day notice. She sat in the hallway on a wooden bench with her phone face down on her knee, and thought about her daughter. About what it would feel like to call her tonight and say that it was over. That a corporation had figured out it was cheaper to destroy a competitor than compete with one. And that the legal system had simply allowed it, not out of malice, but out of indifference. Which was somehow worse. She thought about the 400 people who worked for her. About the receptionist who had been with her since year 2, who brought homemade cornbread to the office every November. About the software engineer who had cried when he got the job, because it was the first time in his career someone had hired him based only on what he could do. She was not a thief. She had never been a thief. The algorithm at the center of this case had been developed by her own team over 18 months, documented in notebooks and version logs, and time-stamped commits that her attorneys had been planning to introduce as evidence. Evidence that was now sitting in folders on a table in a courtroom she was about to walk back into alone. She picked up her phone, put it back down, picked up the folders instead. At the far end of the hallway, a man in gray work clothes was running a mop across the floor in slow, even strokes. He was moving methodically, the way people move when they've done a thing so many times the motion has become automatic. He was somewhere in his early 40s, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that defaulted to serious but wasn't unfriendly. A lanyard with a courthouse ID badge hung around his neck. He noticed her watching him and gave a brief, neutral nod, the acknowledgement of one person to another in a shared space. She nodded back. Then she went back to her folders. His name was Dale Whitmore, and he had been a facilities worker at the Franklin County Federal Courthouse for 6 years. Before that, he had spent 3 years at a firm that did environmental compliance consulting. Before the firm folded and left 17 people unemployed, and Dale with a specialized skill set that did not translate easily into the job market of 2018. Before that, he had gone to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and graduated with a degree in environmental law. He had never passed the bar exam. He had studied for it twice, passed the first portion both times, and failed the second portion by 4 points the first time, and 2 points the second. By then his wife had left and his daughter was 4 years old, and the money for a third attempt didn't exist anywhere he could find it. He did not talk about any of this at work. It was not the kind of thing you talked about when you were mopping floors in a federal courthouse. You learned quickly that certain histories were better kept inside, not out of shame, but because people had already decided what you were based on what they could see, and adding complexity to that picture cost more than it was worth. His daughter was 7 now. Her name was Priya, and she had her mother's dark eyes and Dale's habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She was, in Dale's entirely unbiased assessment, the most interesting person he had ever met. She kept a journal of questions she wanted answered someday. Not a diary, she had explained, with considerable seriousness, because a diary was about what happened and a journal of questions was about what she needed to understand. She had 12 pages of questions so far. 3 of them were about black holes. 1 of them was about why people lie. He had read every document in that hallway without meaning to. It was not something he decided to do. You don't decide to absorb a case while mopping a floor. But Margaret had spread folders across the bench beside her when she ran out of lap space, and Dale had worked his way down the hallway twice, and the pages were turned toward the corridor. And he had read quickly, the way he'd always read, the way that had served him well in law school, before everything else stopped serving him. He had seen the chain of custody documentation. He had seen the version timestamps on the diagnostic code. He had seen the email thread from a Verantis executive, dated 14 months before Verantis claimed the algorithm had been stolen. An email thread that appeared to be an internal discussion about acquiring Clarity Path's technology through other means after a licensing negotiation collapsed. He mopped his way back to the supply closet. He stood inside it with the door half open for a moment. Then he closed it, removed his gloves and walked back to where Margaret was sitting. She looked up. "Ma'am," he said. I know this is not my business. He paused. But, I read the law, before. He said it plainly without apology or performance. I read your documents. The email on page 7 of the third folder. The one from November 2019 with the subject line Alternative Pathways. That document changes everything. Your attorneys were going to let that come out on cross? Margaret stared at him. I'm Dale Whitmore, he said. I work here. I also went to Ohio State for environmental law. I never passed the bar, and I am absolutely not able to represent you in any legal capacity. He held her gaze steadily. But I can sit next to you and tell you exactly which questions to ask. She was quiet for a long moment. Why would you do that? He thought about Priya's journal. About the question she'd written on page 9. If you can help someone and you don't, does that mean you chose not to? Because the email is right there, he said, and they're banking on you not knowing how to use it. Judge Odom looked down from the bench when they returned at 11 o'clock. Margaret was at the defense table. Beside her, in civilian clothes that he had changed into in the men's room, his courthouse ID now clipped to his pocket, rather than hanging from his lanyard, was Dale Whitmore. He had a yellow legal pad. He had a pencil. He had read the third folder 4 more times in the remaining 20 minutes, and he had a handwritten list of questions in the margin. Osei Bonsu, the judge said, with a measured expression that communicated nothing clearly. I have an advisor, she said, a non-attorney advisor, Your Honor, permitted under federal civil procedure. He'll be assisting me in a pro se capacity. Bradford Lee stood up. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It is in fact allowed, Mr. Lee, the judge said. He looked at Dale. Mr. Whitmore, Your Honor. A pause. You understand you may not address the court directly, examine witnesses, or make legal arguments. Yes, Your Honor. Another pause different from the first. Very well. We'll proceed. The Varantis case opened cleanly, the way a well-funded case always does. Bradford Lee was precise and confident. He had demonstratives. Large printed exhibits mounted on foam core, showing a timeline of Clarity Path's diagnostic algorithm development laid alongside Varantis's proprietary codebase. He had an expert witness, a software architect named Dr. Hartwell, who testified with unhurried authority about structural similarities between the two systems. He had a theory of the case that was simple, clear, and devastating. Margaret Bonsu had hired a former Varantis contractor, gained access to their systems through that contractor, and built Clarity Path's most valuable technology on a foundation of stolen work. It was persuasive, it was documented, and it was constructed so that the most important evidence, the actual source code comparison, would come last, for the jury had already formed a picture of who Margaret was. Dale wrote 3 words on the legal pad and slid it to Margaret's left hand. Contractor access logs. She glanced at it. When? What files? Who authorized? She understood. During the first break, Dale explained it in 6 sentences. The contractor, a man named Alec Burrows, whose testimony Varantis had scheduled for day 2, had accessed the Varantis system on 4 dates, the dates Varantis was citing. But the access logs, which Clarity Path had subpoenaed, and which were sitting in folder 5, showed that on 3 of those 4 dates, Burrows had accessed only the project management module. Not the algorithm repository, not the code vault. The project management module, which contained schedules and meeting notes and budget tracking. They're using his access as proof of what he took, Dale said quietly. But the logs show he never opened the right doors. Margaret looked at him. How did my attorneys miss this? Dale's expression didn't change. I don't know. What he thought was, sometimes people miss things when they've already decided a case is unwinnable. What he said was nothing else, because saying it would not help. When Burrows took the stand the next morning, Margaret asked him about the dates. He confirmed them. She asked him what he had accessed. He said the technical repository. She asked him to confirm his login credentials. He confirmed them. She then asked, in the careful language Dale had written for her the night before in a courthouse hallway while eating a sandwich from the vending machine, whether the technical repository he had accessed required a separate authentication token from the standard login. Burrows hesitated. Bradford Lee objected. The objection was overruled. Burroughs said yes. A separate token, generated per session. She asked whether he had that token on the dates in question. A longer hesitation. She asked whether the access logs, which she then introduced as Defendant's Exhibit 14, showed any token generation on his credentials for those dates. They did not. The courtroom was very quiet. Dale kept his face still. On the legal pad, he wrote a single word: next. The next 3 days were methodical in a way that felt to those watching less like a legal defense and more like someone carefully taking apart a machine to show how it had been assembled incorrectly. Margaret asked questions she did not know the answers to, which was terrifying, and Dale told her which ones to ask, which required a trust she had not expected to extend to a man she had met in a hallway 72 hours earlier. But she extended it. Because the access logs had been real, and the hesitation had been real, and when you are standing in a burning building you do not ask person with a fire extinguisher for their credentials. The email was introduced on day 3. The November 2019 email from Verantis' VP of Strategy, a man named Gregory Falke, to 3 members of the executive team. The subject line: Alternative Pathways, Clarity Path. The body, which Margaret read aloud into the record, described Clarity Path's diagnostic platform as the most serious competitive threat in the mid-market segment, and outlined a series of options for neutralizing it. Option 1 was a renewed licensing approach. Option 2 was a talent acquisition strategy, recruiting key Clarity Path engineers. Option 3, the one at the bottom of the page which had 3 asterisks beside it, and the notation last resort, requires legal coordination, read. Initiate IP challenge based on Burroughs' access history. Outcome uncertain but disruptive. The courtroom was not quiet this time. The gallery shifted. Someone in the back row said something under their breath. Bradford Lee's second chair leaned over and whispered something, and Bradford Lee's jaw tightened very slightly, the way jaws tighten when someone has just confirmed a fear they had been managing for weeks. Judge Odom called for order. Dale wrote one more word on the legal pad: wait. Margaret waited. It was the right instinct. Let the document breathe. Let the jury read it. Let it sit in the room for a moment before you try to explain it, because juries understand things better when they arrive at meaning on their own. Then she asked, evenly, whether the date on this email, November 14, 2019, preceded or followed the date on which Verantis had filed its initial complaint. It preceded it. By 16 months. The cross-examination of Dr. Hartwell, the expert, was the part Dale had prepared most carefully. He had written the questions in a specific sequence, because sequence mattered, not the questions themselves but the order in which they arrived, because the goal was not to attack the expert, but to redirect attention to a single point that the expert had been carefully positioned to obscure. The structural similarities between the 2 codebases were real. Dale did not dispute this with Margaret. He told her not to dispute it. Don't fight the similarity, he said. Fight the interpretation. Margaret asked Dr. Hartwell about the foundation architecture both systems shared. He explained it. She asked whether this architecture was proprietary to Verantis. He said it was standard in the field. She asked whether there were published academic papers describing this architecture. He said yes. She asked whether Clarity Path's developers would have had access to those papers without access to his systems. He said yes. She asked, then, whether it was possible, not certain but possible, that 2 teams working from the same published research, in the same technical period, with the same end goal, might independently arrive at similar structural solutions. He said, with visible reluctance, that it was possible. She asked whether the similarities Verantis was citing were consistent with independent parallel development from shared published sources. He said, with more visible reluctance, that he could not rule it out. Dale did not write anything on the legal pad. He simply looked at the table. The plaintiff's case had taken 5 days to build. It took Margaret 3 days to take it apart, question by question, document by document, in the careful way that Dale had learned in law school, and never used because the exam score had been 2 points too low. And then everything else had happened. He did not think about that during the trial. He thought about it, in the parking lot at night, driving home to his apartment where Priya was staying with her grandmother. But not during the trial. During the trial he thought only about the next question. On the last afternoon, Bradford Lee made his closing argument. It was polished and confident, and it rested entirely on the structural similarities and the burrow's access, both of which had been significantly damaged but not destroyed. He asked the jury to consider what was more likely, a coincidence or a theft. He said the word coincidence 3 times in a way that made it sound like an insult. Margaret made her closing argument from notes she had written herself, with Dale's outline as a skeleton beneath them. She did not use the word coincidence. She used the word evidence. She talked about the email. She talked about the access logs. She talked about the 18 months her team had spent in a converted conference room, with coffee cups and version control software, and a whiteboard covered in their own equations, building something from the ground up. She talked about 400 employees who showed up every day to a company that had been built, honestly. She did not cry. She had known she was not going to cry. She said, at the end, very simply, I didn't take anything. I built something. The documents in this record will show you exactly how, and exactly when, and I'm asking you to read them. The jury was out for 2 days. Dale mopped floors and did not think about it, which was not entirely true. He thought about it constantly, in the particular way that people think about things they cannot affect, which is to say he thought about it, and then set it down and then picked it up again. On the afternoon of the second day, Priya called him during his break. She was with her grandmother and she wanted to tell him about a question she had added to her journal. The question was, if you know how to do something that nobody thinks you can do, is that a superpower? He sat with the phone against his ear for a moment. Yeah, he said. I think that counts. I thought so, she said. She sounded satisfied. Okay. Bye, Dad. The jury came back at 4:17. Not guilty on all counts. Margaret heard the verdict and was still for a moment that lasted longer than a breath, sitting at the table where she had sat alone 3 weeks ago, and looking at the same empty chairs where her attorneys had been. Then she exhaled, slowly, through her nose, the way her father had taught her. Outside the courthouse, in the gray October light that had not changed much since the day this began, she found Dale in the parking lot, still in the civilian clothes he wore to court every day. He was standing by a 10-year-old Civic with a car seat in the back, and he was unlocking it. And he did not hear her coming until she said his name. He turned. She said thank you. 2 words, directly, without preamble. She was not a person who softened things with extra language. He nodded. You did the work. You knew which work to do. She paused. Varantis is going to face sanctions motions, and I'm going to need someone who understands how to read documents. Another pause. I'm told there are provisions for supervised legal practice under attorney oversight. I'm planning to find an attorney willing to provide that oversight. Dale looked at her. You're offering me a job. I'm describing a situation, she said, in which a position might exist. He looked at the car seat, the 10-year-old Civic. He thought about Priya's question, the one she'd written in her journal in careful pencil letters that she pressed too hard because she always pressed too hard when something felt important. I'd have to study for the bar again, he said. There are resources for that. He was quiet for a moment. She's 7, he said, which was not a complete sentence, but explained everything. Margaret nodded. I know. 2 years later, Clarity Path's Columbus office added a 3rd-floor suite that housed something that had not existed before. It was called the Whitmore Legal Access Project, and it was staffed by 2 junior attorneys and 1 man named Dale Whitmore, who had finally passed the Ohio bar exam on his 3rd attempt by 12 points on a Tuesday morning in March. He had not told anyone he was taking it again. He had taken the call from the testing board in his car, in a parking garage, with Priya's drawing of a superhero in a custodian uniform, taped to the dashboard because she had made it for him 3 years ago, and he had never taken it down. The project offered free legal consultation to small business owners in Central Ohio who couldn't afford representation. The first appointment was scheduled for the following Monday. They had 43 people on the waiting list. Priya, now 9, had updated her journal of questions. She had crossed out the one about whether knowing how to do something nobody expected was a superpower, because she had decided she knew the answer. In its place she had written a new question, and she had underlined it twice. How many people can one person help if they don't give up? She had not written an answer yet. She thought it might take a while to find out.